sound plan. Justice shall be done. Certainly, of course, for honor. A sound plan. Certainly, of course, for honor. For honor. Certainly, of course, a sound plan. Of course, the light is my strength. For honor. Certainly, a sound plan. A sound plan.
Give me something to do!
Is there danger?
Wait till you see
I'm
me
here
in
to help.
action.
I stand for the light. The light is my strength. Certainly,
Wait till you
of
see
course,
me in action.
for honor. Is there danger? A sound
Welcome
plan.
to our village.
Justice shall be done. For honor. Of course. I stand for the light. I'm here to help. Certainly, the light is my strength. Is there danger? I stand for the light. I'm here to help. Justice shall be done. Certainly, the light is my strength. A sound plan. For honor. Is there danger? Of course, certainly. Justice shall be done. For honor, of course. I stand for the light. A sound plan. For honor. A sound plan. Of course, certainly. A sound plan. Certainly. For honor. Of course. For honor. Certainly. Of course. A sound plan. For honor. A sound plan. Of course. Certainly. Certainly. A sound plan. Of course. For honor. I'm here to help. For honor. Of course. Certainly. A sound plan. Certainly. A sound plan. I'm here to help. Of course. For honor. A sound plan. For honor. Of course. Certainly. A sound plan. Certainly. For honor. Foul name. Of course. I stand for the light. For honor. Of course. Certainly. Justice shall be done. A sound plan. Of course. Certainly. For honor. A sound plan. A sound plan. For honor. Of course. Certainly. Of course. For honor. Certainly. A sound plan. A sound plan. Of course. Certainly. For honor. A sound plan. Of course. For honor. Certainly. A sound plan. Certainly. Of course.
You are past me now.
For honor. A sound plan. Certainly. Of course. For my father, the king. A sound plan. For honor. Certainly. A sound plan. Certainly. Of course. For honor. A sound plan. Of course. Certainly. A sound plan. Certainly. For honor. Of course. Certainly. Of course.
Justice.
A sound plan. A sound plan. Certainly. Of course. For honor. Of course. For honor. A sound plan. Certainly. Certainly. A sound plan. For honor. Certainly. A sound plan. For honor. Of course. Of course. Certainly. A sound plan. For honor. For honor. A sound plan. Certainly. For honor. Certainly. A sound plan. Of course. A sound plan. Certainly. For honor. Of course. Certainly. A sound plan. Of course. For honor. A sound plan. For honor.
Betrayer of light.
Of course. Certainly. A sound plan.
Feel my wrath.
Of course. Justice. For honor. Certainly. For honor. Certainly. A sound plan. Of course. For honor. Is there danger? The light is my strength. Justice shall be done. A sound plan. Certainly. Of course. For honor. A sound plan. Certainly. Of course. Is there danger? Certainly. A sound plan. I'm here to help. The light is my strength. course. Certainly. A sound plan. For honor. Certainly. For honor. Of course. A sound plan. Certainly. A sound plan. Of course. For honor. Of course. Certainly. A sound plan. A sound plan. Certainly. Of course. Of course. A sound plan. Is there danger? For honor. Certainly. For honor. Certainly. A sound plan. I stand for the light. Of course. Of course. Justice. Certainly. Justice shall be done. For honor. A sound plan. For honor. A sound plan. I stand for the light. Of course. Certainly. For honor. Certainly. A sound. Of course. A sound plan. I'm here to help. Certainly. The light is my strength. Of course. For honor. A sound plan. Of course. Is there danger? For honor. Certainly. For honor. The light is my strength. Of course. A sound plan. Certainly. Certainly. Justice shall be done.
First blood.
For honor. Of course. A sound plan. I'm here to help. Certainly. A sound plan. For honor. Of course. A sound plan. Of course. Certainly. I stand for the light. For honor. A sound plan. For honor. Of course. Certainly.
Feel my wrath.
For my father, the
Our
king.
forces are under attack.
Certainly. Is there danger?
Our
A
brethren's
sound
town is under
For
attack.
honor. Of course. Is there danger? A sound plan. For honor. I'm here to help. Certainly. Of course. Foul name. Sound plan.
Prayer of light.
Of course. For honor. Certainly. Of course. A sound plan. Certainly. For honor.
You are past me.
A sound plan. Certainly. For honor. Certainly. The light. A sound plan. Justice shall be done. Of course.
Our brethren's town is under attack.
Of course. For my father. A sound plan. Certainly. Justice is down. A sound plan. Of course. For honor. Of course. Certainly. For honor. A sound plan. Of
Our
course.
brethren's
A
town
sound
is under
plan.
attack.
For honor. I stand for the light. Certainly. For honor. Certainly. Of course. A sound. Found. Of course. A sound. A sound. For honor. Of course. Certainly. A sound plan. Of course. For honor. Certainly. For honor. A sound plan. Certainly. Of course. Of course. Certainly. A sound. Is there danger? For honor. A sound plan. Certainly. For honor. Of course. For honor. A sound plan. Certainly. Of course. Of course. Certainly. A sound plan. For honor. For Lord or for honor. I stand for the light. Of course. I'm here to help. Certainly. A sound plan. Of course. For honor. Certainly. Of course. A sound plan. Certainly. Justice shall be done. A sound plan. The light is my strength. I'm here to help. For honor. Of course. Certainly. Certainly. For honor. Of course. A sound plan. Certainly. For honor. A sound plan. Is there danger? Of course. Of course. Certainly. A sound for honor. Certainly. I stand for the light. A sound plan. Of course. Justice shall be done. Is my strength for honor. A sound plan. Is there danger? I stand for the light. Certainly. Of course. For honor. A sound plan. Justice shall be done. I'm here to help. For honor. Of course. Certainly. A sound plan. For honor. Certainly. Of course. Of course. A sound plan. Certainly. The light is my strength. For honor. Of course. A sound plan. For honor. Certainly. I stand for the light. Is there danger?
Our brethren's town is under attack.
Of course. The light is my strength. Certainly. I'm here to help. For honor. Of course. Certainly. A sound plan. For honor. Certainly. A sound plan. For honor. Of course. Certainly. A sound plan. Of course. Justice shall be done. For honor. A sound plan. For honor. Certainly. The light is my strength. For Lord or honor.
Betrayer of the light.
Of course. Certainly. Bow name.
Betrayer of the light.
A sound plan. For honor. Of course. Of course. For honor. A sound plan. Certainly. For honor. Certainly. A sound plan. Of course. A sound plan.
Justice is
Certainly. For honor. Of course. Certainly. For honor. Of course. A sound plan. A sound plan. For honor. Certainly. Of course. A sound plan. For honor. Certainly. For honor. Of course. Certainly. A sound plan. For honor. Of course. I'm here to help. Certainly. A sound plan. A sound plan. Certainly. For honor. Of course. I stand for the light. Of course, justice shall be
Our
done.
brethren's
A
town is
sound
under
plan.
attack.
For honor. Certainly. Is there danger? A sound plan. The light is my strength. Justice shall be done. For honor. Of course. Certainly. A sound plan. Of course. For honor. Certainly. A sound.
You are past redemption.
Certainly. Of course. For honor. A sound plan. Certainly. I'm here to help. Of course. For honor. Certainly. Of course. A sound plan. For honor. A sound plan. For my father, the king. Certainly. Of course. For honor. A sound plan. Of course. Certainly. For honor. Is there danger? A sound plan. For honor. Certainly. Of course. I stand for the light.
Our brethren's town is under attack.
Justice shall be done. Certainly. I stand for the light. For honor. A sound plan. Of course. For honor. A sound plan. Certainly. Of course. For honor. A sound plan. Certainly. Of course. Of course. A sound plan.
Feel my wrath.
For honor. Certainly. A
Our
sound
brethren's
plan.
town is under
there
attack.
danger? For honor. Of course. Certainly. A sound plan. I'm here to help. For honor. Certainly.
Take your time.
The light is
Look
my
around.
strength. Justice. Of course. Certainly. Of course. For honor. A sound plan. For honor. Of course. Certainly. A sound plan. Certainly. A sound plan. For honor. Of course. A sound plan. For honor. Of course. Is there danger? Certainly. Of course. The light is my strength. A sound
Our
plan.
brethren's town is under attack.
For honor. Certainly. A sound plan. For honor. Of course.
Justice is gone.
Certainly.
Are you threatening me?
A sound plan. Certainly. For honor. Of course.
Betrayer of the light.
A sound plan. Certainly.
Our
I
brethren's
stand for
town
the
is is under attack.
Justice shall be done. Of course. Is there danger? I'm here to help. For honor. Certainly. Of course. For honor. A sound plan. A sound plan. Of course.
You are past redemption. Feel my
Certainly. For honor. Of course. Certainly.
Our brethren's
honor.
town is under attack.
Sound plan. Certainly. A sound plan. For honor. Of course. Certainly. Of course. A sound plan. For honor. For honor. A sound plan. Certainly. Of course. Of course. I stand
My
for
life,
the light.
Bonazul.
The light is my strength. A sound plan. Certainly. For honor. A sound plan. Certainly. For honor.
Our brethren's town is under attack.
Of course. A sound plan. Of course. Certainly. For honor. The light is my strength. Of course. Certainly.
Hello.
I stand for the light. A sound plan. For honor. I'm here to help.
Our brethren's town is under attack.
Justice shall be done. Certainly. Justice is coming. Is there danger? A sound plan.
Our forces are under attack.
Justice shall be done. A sound plan. Of course. A sound plan. I'm here to help. A sound plan.
Pray for my hope.
For honor. A sound plan. Certainly. A sound plan. For honor. Of course. For honor. Certainly. A sound
Our
plan.
brethren's town is under attack.
For honor. Of course. A sound plan. Of course. Certainly. For honor.
Feel my wrath.
Of course. Certainly. I stand for the light. For honor. For honor. A sound plan. Of course. Certainly. A sound plan. Foul name.
You are past redemption.
Of course. For honor. Certainly. Of course. Certainly. A sound plan. Of course. For honor. A sound plan. Certainly. A sound plan. Of course.
Are you threatening me?
The light is my strength. For honor. Certainly. Certainly. Is there danger? Of course. For honor. Justice shall be done. A sound plan. Certainly. For honor. A sound plan. Of course. Certainly. I'm here to help. For honor. A sound plan. For honor. Certainly. Of course. For honor. A sound plan. Of course. Certainly. Foul. For honor. Certainly. Of course. A sound plan. For honor. A sound plan. Is there danger? I stand for the light.
Our brethren's
light is
town is
strength.
under attack.
What?
I'm here to help. I stand for the light. Of course. Certainly. For honor. Is there danger? Certainly. The light. This shall be done. A sound. Certainly, a sound plan. Of course, for honor. For honor. Certainly, a sound plan. Of course, for honor. The light is my strength. A sound plan. Is there danger? I stand for the light. Certainly. For honor. Certainly. Of course. For honor. A sound plan. A sound plan. For honor. Certainly. Of course. For honor. Justice shall be done. Of course. Certainly. Is there danger? A sound plan. For honor. I stand for the
Our
light.
brethren's
Of
town
course.
is under attack.
I stand for the light. The light is my strength. Certainly. I'm here to help.
What?
I am ready. Yes, is there danger? For honor. Of course.
Our
Certainly.
brethren's town is under
A
attack.
sound. Of course.
For Lord.
Certainly. For honor. Of course. A sound. For honor. Certainly. Of course. Certainly. A sound plan. For honor. For honor. Of course. Certainly. A sound plan. For honor. Of course. A sound plan. Certainly.
Justice has come.
A sound. Certainly. Certainly. Of course. For honor.
Are you
What
threatening
is?
me?
Justice shall be done.
Our brethren's
Sound.
town is under attack.
Justice shall be done. Of course. I stand for the light. I'm here to help. Is there danger? Certainly. The light is my strength. For honor. A sound. For honor. My father did A sound plan.
You are past me.
Certainly.
Justice is
Of course. A sound plan. Of course. A sound.
Are you threatening me?
I'm here to help. Justice.
What?
Is there danger? For honor. Of course. Certainly. The light is my strength. I stand for the light. Is there danger? Certainly. Justice shall be done. I stand for the light. The light is my strength. A sound plan. For honor. Of course. For honor. Certainly.
feel my wrath.
Of course. Foul knave. Of course.
Betrayer of light. Feel my wrath.
A sound. For honor. Certainly.
Justice has come.
For honor. Certainly. For my father, the king. Of course. A sound. Of course. For honor. Certainly. A sound plan. I'm here to help. A sound plan. For honor. Certainly. Certainly. A sound plan. Of course. For honor. For honor. A sound. Of course. For honor. Of course. A sound plan. Certainly. Of course. I'm here to help. A sound plan. Certainly. For honor. For honor.
Greetings,
The
my
light
lord.
is my strength. Justice shall be done. I stand for the light. Certainly, of course. A sound. A sound. Of course. For honor. Certainly. A sound. Of course. For honor. Of course. Is there danger? Justice shall be done. A sound plan. Is there danger? For honor. Certainly. I stand for the light. Of course. A sound plan. For honor. Certainly. Certainly. Of course. A sound plan. For honor. A sound plan. For honor. The light is my strength. I'm here to help. Certainly. Is there danger? Of course. A sound plan. Of course. Certainly. For honor. Of course. A sound plan. For honor. Certainly. I stand for the light. Certainly. Justice shall be done. For honor. A sound plan. Of course. For honor. Certainly. Of course. A sound. A sound. Of course. Certainly. The light is my course. Justice shall be done. A sound plan. Certainly. I stand for the light. I'm here to help. Of course, for honor. The light is my strength. A sound plan. Justice shall be done. Certainly. A sound plan.
Welcome to our village.
Of course. Is there danger? For honor. Certainly. I'm here to help. Of course. For honor. A sound plan. Certainly. Of course. For honor.
Welcome to
I
our
stand
village.
for the light. A sound plan. I'm here to help. A sound plan. Certainly.
You are past redemption.
For honor. Of course. A sound plan. The light is my strength. Certainly. For honor. Of course. A sound plan. Certainly. For honor. A sound plan. Certainly. Of course. For honor. Of course. For honor. A sound plan. Certainly. Certainly. A sound plan. Of course. Certainly. A sound plan. For honor. Of course. For honor. Certainly. I stand for the light. A sound plan. Of course. A sound plan. Is there danger? Justice shall be done. Is there danger? Of course. I stand for the light. Certainly. The light is my strength. For honor. Certainly. For honor. Of course. A sound plan. A sound plan. For honor. Of course. Certainly. Certainly. For honor. Of course. A sound plan. Of course. Certainly. For honor. A sound plan. Certainly. A sound plan.
Are you threatening me?
Justice shall be done. Justice shall be done. I stand for the light. Of course. For honor. A sound plan. Of course. For honor. Is there danger? The light is my strength. I'm here to help. I'm here to help. The light is my strength. Certainly. Certainly. Of course. A sound plan. For honor. Certainly. For honor.
Are you threatening me?
I stand for the light. A sound plan. Of course. Certainly. For honor. A sound plan.
Betrayer of the light.
Of course. For honor. Certainly.
You are past redemption.
A sound plan. Of course. Of course. For honor. Certainly. A sound plan. For honor. Of course. For
Double kill.
For honor. A sound plan. Is there danger? Justice shall be done. Certainly. Of course. Of course.
Justice has come.
Is there danger? The light is my strength. For honor. I'm here to help. I stand for the light. Justice shall be done. I stand for the light. The light is my strength.
Betrayer of the light. Our brethren's
Sound plan. I'm here to help. Certainly.
Unstoppable.
Of course. Is there danger? A sound plan. Certainly. Justice shall be done. Is there danger?
Feel my wrath. Our brethren's town is under attack.
Are you threatening me?
Of course. I stand for the light. Foul name. For honor. A sound plan. The light is my strength. Certainly.
Is my
I
aim.
stand for the light.
Is someone injured?
Are you threatening
Justice
me?
shall be done. For honor. Certainly. The light is my strength. Is that dangerous?
Betrayal of light.
For justice. Of course. A sound plan. I'm here to help. Certainly. For honor. For honor. Is there danger? Of course. Certainly. A sound plan. Certainly. A sound plan. For honor. Of course. For honor. A sound plan. Certainly. For my father's king. Of course. A sound plan. I'm here to help. For honor. Of course. Certainly. A sound plan. Certainly. Justice shall be done. For honor. Of course.
What?
I stand for the light. Certainly. For honor. Of course. A sound plan.
Our brethren's town is under attack.
A sound plan. Certainly. I stand for the light. Of course. Certainly. For honor. A sound plan. Of course. For honor. Certainly. A sound plan. Of course. For honor. Certainly. Of course. A sound plan. A sound plan. Of course. Certainly. The light is my strength. For honor. Certainly. Of course. For honor. A sound plan. Certainly. A sound plan. Is there danger? Justice shall be done. I'm here to help. For honor. Of course. I'm here to help. Justice shall be done. A sound plan. I stand for the light. Certainly. For honor. Of course. Certainly. For honor. A sound plan. Of course. A sound plan. For honor. Certainly. Is there danger? Of course. A sound plan. Certainly. For honor. Of course. Certainly. Of course. For honor. A sound plan. Of course. Certainly. A sound plan. The light is my strength. For honor. Certainly. For honor. Of course. The light is my strength. A sound. For honor. A sound plan. Of course. Justice shall be done. Certainly. A sound plan. For honor. Of course. Certainly. I stand for the light. Of course. Is there danger? For honor. Certainly. A sound plan. Of course. Certainly. For honor. A sound plan. For honor. Certainly. For honor. Certainly. A sound plan. Of course. For honor. Certainly. A sound plan. Of course. A sound plan. I'm here to help. For honor. Light is my strength. Certainly. Certainly. A sound plan. For honor. Of course. Certainly. A sound plan. For honor. Of course. For honor. I'm here to help. Certainly. A sound plan. Of course.
Our brethren's town is under attack.
I stand for the light. Certainly. A sound plan. Of course. Justice shall be done. For honor. A sound plan. Certainly. Of course. For honor. A sound plan. Certainly. there danger? Justice shall be done. Certainly, the light is my strength. A sound plan. I stand for the light.
Are you threatening me?
I'm here to help for honor. I stand for the light. I'm here to help, of course, certainly, for honor. The light is my strength. Justice shall be done. A sound plan for honor. A sound plan. Of course. Is there danger? Of course. I stand for the light. Is there danger? A sound plan. Of course. A sound plan. Of course. Certainly. A sound plan for honor. Certainly. For honor. A sound plan. Of course. Certainly. A sound plan. Of course. For honor.
Our brethren's town is under attack.
Help. For honor. A sound plan. Certainly, justice shall be done. A sound plan for honor, of course. A sound plan. Certainly, a sound plan for honor. Of course, I'm here to help. For honor, a sound plan. Is there danger? Certainly, of course. Certainly, a sound plan. Of course. Certainly. A sound plan. Of course, for honor. A sound plan. Of course, for honor. Certainly. A sound plan. Justice shall be done. Of course, the light is my strength. I stand for the light. For honor. A sound plan. Certainly. For honor. Of course. Certainly. A sound plan. Certainly. A sound plan. For honor. Of course. Of course. I'm here to help.
Our forces are under attack.
Certainly. Is there danger? A sound plan. For honor. For honor. Of course. A sound plan. The light is my strength. Certainly. I'm here to help.
Are you
I
threatening
stand
me?
for the light. Justice shall be done. Is there danger? A sound plan. Justice shall be done. I'm here to help. The light is my strength. I stand for the light. I'm here to help. Certainly. Certainly. Justice shall be done. The light is my strength. For honor. Is there danger? You are past redemption. Foul name. I stand for the light. Justice. Father, the king. Of course. A sound plan. A sound plan. For honor. Certainly. I'm here to help. Of course. A sound plan. For honor. I stand for the light. Certainly. Is there danger? Of course. The light is my
Killing
strength.
spree.
Certainly. Of course. For honor. Is there danger? The light is my strength. Certainly. A sound plan. Justice shall be done. For honor. Of course. I'm here to help. I stand for the light. For honor. Certainly. A sound plan. I stand for the light. Is there danger? The light is my strength. Of course. Of course. Justice shall be done. A sound plan. I'm here to help. Is there danger? Sir, justice shall be done. I stand for the light. The light is my strength. Sound plan. For honor.
Our forces are under attack.
I'm here to help.
Betrayer of the light.
The light is my strength. Certainly. Certainly. For honor. Of course. Sound plan. Is there danger? Of course. For honor. Certainly. Of course. A sound plan. Of course. For honor. A sound plan. Certainly. A sound plan. Of course. For honor. Certainly.
Our forces are under attack.
For honor. Certainly.
What?
Is my aid required?
Are you threatening me? What?
The light is my strength. Justice shall be done. Is there danger? A sound plan. The light is my strength. Justice shall be done. Certainly. A sound plan. Of course. For honor. Certainly. For honor. Of course. A sound plan. Of course. I stand for the light. A sound plan. A sound plan. Certainly. Of course. For honor. Of course. Certainly. A sound